So you woke up in medieval Europe. Let's pretend that the world of disease, famine, and lack of personal hygiene wasn't enough. How about we introduce another wrench into the mix? A mysterious sickness that has you questioning every sneeze, cough, or fever dream. Yep, that's right. We're talking about bubonic plague, otherwise known as the Black Death, the illness that killed nearly half of Europe's population in the 14th century. Let's dive into the details. Welcome back. As we continue our enlightening journey into medieval Europe, it's time to turn up the heat on a topic that will send chills down your spine: the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death. This illness, with a dark cloud hanging over medieval Europe, killing millions and leaving a trail of despair and mystery in its wake. This horrifying epidemic was caused by bacteria carried by fleas living on rats. Imagine being surrounded by these tiny disease factories, these vermin carrying invisible threats that could take your life in a matter of days. What would you do? So let's say you managed to wake up one morning in medieval Europe thinking you're ready to tackle the day. Little did you know that today is the day that your fate takes a dark turn. The Black Death has arrived in town and you're smack in the middle of it. Oh, how cruel fate can be. You find yourself caught in a town square teeming with people, going about their daily business, completely unaware of the danger lurking around every corner. Suddenly, a hush falls over the crowd. Someone is crying, pointing towards a newcomer who looks unwell. Rumor spreads like wildfire and fear grips the townspeople. Could it be the dreaded pestilence? Is this person walking death itself? The mysterious illness started in Asia, moved across the trade routes, and landed in Europe in 1347. Brought by rats on ships, it spread like wildfire, infecting and killing millions within decades. By 1350, the Black Death had reached England, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, taking lives. Its victims initially suffered from fever, weakness, aches, chills, and painful swellings in the groin or armpits. These symptoms were a warning sign, a grim foreshadowing of what was to come. Once infected, the plague bacteria multiplied in the lymph nodes, causing them to become swollen and painful. These buboes, as they were called, were the telltale signs of the deadly disease. But the terror didn't end there. As the buboes grew, they burst, releasing a foul-smelling pus that oozed from the skin. It was a horrific sight that struck fear into the hearts of all who witnessed it. Those unfortunate enough to contract the disease faced agonizing symptoms that tested the limits of human endurance. Some experienced vomiting, diarrhea, and internal bleeding. Others suffered from delirium, convulsions, and paralysis. As the disease progressed, the physical torment became unbearable. Victims often succumbed to the plague within a week after the onset of these gruesome symptoms. The Black Death was indiscriminate, attacking rich and poor alike. Entire families were wiped out, leaving villages depopulated and the countryside desolate. With medical knowledge limited, people turned to desperate measures and strange remedies in a bid to fight the disease. But nothing could stop the relentless plague. The air grew heavy with the stench of death as thousands perished. The streets became a macabre parade of suffering and despair. The Black Death had a profound impact on medieval Europe. It led to social upheaval, economic changes, and a shift in religious beliefs. The decimation of the population led to labor shortages, and the manorial system began to decline. The plague also contributed to the rise of anti-Semitism, as Jews were often blamed for the spread of the disease. The impact of the Black Death was so profound that it left an indelible mark on history. The memories of the suffering and loss endured during this dark period continued to haunt European societies for centuries to come. Even today, the specter of the Black Death serves as a reminder of the devastating consequences of disease and the fragility of human life. When the Black Death hits your town, escape seems like the best option. So where can you go? The countryside, perhaps. Wrong. The plague is rampant everywhere. Small villages have become cesspools of infection. The only path forward is the crowded road leading to the nearest city. No oasis of safety awaits you there. Every port, market, crossroads, and inn is filled with infected travelers who unknowingly spread the pestilence with every step. retreating indoors might seem like a good idea. After all, staying at home sounds safe, right? Unfortunately, there's no escape from the Black Death within four walls. Homes, inns, and even monasteries are breeding grounds for rats and fleas carrying the deadly disease. It's a nightmare scenario with no easy solutions. The cramped, unsanitary conditions provide the perfect environment for the plague to thrive. The streets, markets, and homes are all infested with these disease-ridden rodents, making escape nearly impossible. You may try to hide and hope for the best, but the plague finds its victims wherever they may be hiding. Infected rats can easily find their way into your home through cracks in the walls or openings in the windows. The fleas that infest them jump from their rodent hosts onto humans, transmitting the deadly disease with their bites. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The plague has descended upon medieval Europe, trapping you in a terrifying cycle of fear, illness, and death. The question is, how will you survive? Can you outrun the disease, or will you fall victim to its relentless grip? All you can do is try your best to avoid the disease and hope for a cure. Maybe those medicines your mom gave you were onto something. Whatever you do, stay indoors and avoid contact with others. The worst case scenario, you fall ill with the plague. So what next? If you do get sick, treat your symptoms with the most common medieval remedy of the time. It involved cutting or leeching blood to balance the humors. Oh, joy! This practice not only proved ineffective, but often worsened the condition of the afflicted. Now it's time to wrap up your night in medieval Europe. As darkness falls, you retreat to your humble abode, or maybe it's just your hut again, and try to forget the horrors of the day. But the night brings its own set of challenges. Lighting is limited to a single flickering candle or a small fire, and that only reveals more unsettling thing. Mold on the walls, bugs on the ceiling, and dirt caked under the door. The silence is broken by the sounds of nocturnal creatures rustling outside. Add in the occasional shriek from a cat or dog that has found more interesting prey than you. You might hope to distract yourself with entertainment. Too bad. That's a luxury you can't afford. Chess and books aren't popular. Games of chance are rare. Most people spend their free time drinking and socializing, if you're lucky. Someone might be playing a stringed instrument or telling stories, but that's only if you can afford a tavern and the drinks to drown your sorrows. So you probably wind up staring at the walls or counting cracks in the ceiling, dreaming of a modern bed, Netflix, and a bathroom with a proper No one ever said medieval Europe was a vacation spot. Sure, it's filled with adventure, intrigue, and sights and sounds you won't forget. But it is also a place where diseases can wipe out half the population and a hot bath might kill you. In many ways, it's a step backward from the comforts and safety of modern life. But hey, who needs sleep anyway, right? After a night like that, it's not uncommon for medieval Europeans to sleep with one eye open, tossing and turning, listening intently for any disturbance, fearing it could be the harbinger of more misfortune. The absence of proper bedding and the constant threat of unwanted visitors or illness make it difficult to relax, even when trying to sleep. As the sun rises again, you ask yourself, is it worth another day in medieval Europe? Will the Black Death spare you one more day? Only time will tell. Sleep becomes a luxury, reserved for the fortunate few who can afford a semblance of comfort and security. For most, rest is a fleeting visitor who arrives only when the body is too tired to resist. Rest in peace. You just stubbed your toe. You're in agony, but you can't do anything about it because you're 148 centimeters tall. You're small, like all the other women in the village. Doctors measure you and determine your size, suits your stature. You're not fat, thin, nor short. What could be a lack of options? Many of the Middle Ages is known for its bland food. They urinated against walls, and buckets have simply left their marks. If you lived in town, chances are you shared a public bathroom. Sometimes it was a hole dug in the ground. Other times, it was a shallow pit with a board across it. If you lived in the countryside, you'd relieve yourself behind a tree or in the river. No toilet paper. Try leaves moss, or whatever else you had handy. If you were a woman, you faced additional challenges. First, you had to find a private place to relieve yourself. Second, you had to deal with catcalls and groping. There was no such thing as public decency in the Middle Ages. If you were lucky, you had a private chamber pot in your house. It was usually a bucket or wooden box with a hole in it. The downside, your bedroom doubled as a bathroom. You didn't flush the waste away though. You tossed it out the window. Yep, in the Middle Ages, it was legal to throw garbage buckets and waste out your window. If you walked around town, watch your head. You never knew what came raining down next. This led to some deaths. People walking below got hit by objects falling from above. No law protected you from flying waste, and the odds were against you. A higher floor meant more potential enemies aiming at your head. Nothing spices up your meal, except the rat dancing on your plate. In the Middle Ages, sleeping meant listening to rats squeaking, flies buzzing, and dogs barking. Your bed is full of creepy crawlies too. As soon as you lie down, you feel something crawling on you. You turn over and find another bug. These little creatures are cozying up to your warmth. Your sheets are rarely clean. You wash them maybe once a year. Plus, you share your bed with lice, fleas, and other critters. Don't worry, these tiny parasites love you so much they moved in. They suck your blood and lay eggs on your skin. Occasionally, you wake up with spots. Are they kisses or the plague? Who knows? Once you get comfortable, someone joins you. In the Middle Ages, it was normal for families to share a bed. A mom, dad, and several kids cuddle together. Sleeping bags are hundreds of years away. Your mattress is straw or wood shavings. It's firm and uncomfortable. But hey, at least it's not louse-infested like the sheet. Your diet depends on the season and location. Most people ate 3 meals a day. Breakfast was bread and cheese. Lunch was usually bread, cheese, and fruit. Dinner was vegetables, meat, and milk. It sounds okay, but it gets monotonous fast. Salt, pepper, and maybe an herb spice up your meal. If you're lucky enough to see these ingredients, regional specialties existed, but most of Europe ate the same bland dishes. Do you hate wasting food? You're in the right place. Leftovers are rare. Anything left on your plate goes to the pigs. No doggy bags or composting. Bread is the staple. It's cheap and lasts long. This is good news for peasants and bad for your teeth. Wine or cider accompany your meal, especially since water may be dirty. Pepper was a sign of wealth. The more you sprinkled on your dish, the wealthier you were. If you were a king, you got to eat delicacies from all over the world. You could have exotic fruits, spices, and ingredients no one else could find. But if you weren't the king, your meal was boring and repetitive, and the presentation sucked. No plates, only bowls. They didn't have forks, only spoons, and they never washed their hands before or after eating. It was expected. You'd pick a bug or two off your food. Just rip it off and eat the rest. No complaints. You're properly proportioned. Being petite was the norm for medieval women. If you were 170 centimeters tall, you'd be considered abnormally large. When they examined you, doctors didn't use modern equipment. They only had pulse taking, urine tasting, and feeling your stomach to diagnose you. They had no idea what caused illness, and it wasn't just theories. It was God's punishment. If you had the plague, it was God telling you to repent. Doctors recommended cures that sound more ridiculous than Squid Game. For a cough, they suggested sticking a frog down your shirt. To cure tuberculosis, try putting a dead cat on your chest. And if you had a broken bone, get a manicure. After all, they thought bacteria entered the body through pores. How many jobs do you want? Back then, having multiple jobs was considered shameful. Men were supposed to stick to one occupation their whole life. If you were an apprentice, you started at the bottom and worked your way up. Then you gotta decide what kind of master you wanted to be. Was it a baker, butcher, or cobbler you chose? But that took years. For example, to become a surgeon, you needed 7 years of training. Now imagine you're a young boy growing up in the Middle Ages. One day you decided you wanted to be a knight, So you told your father, "I want to be a knight." And he said, "No, you can't be a knight. You're born a knight. You cannot learn it. You cannot choose to be one. So you're destined to be a peasant unless you're born into nobility. You couldn't advance your social status even if you tried. It sucked. You've lost your appetite. In the Middle Ages, toilets were not invented yet. So where did people pee and poop? Anywhere. You're ready to sleep. Great. But don't expect a comfortable night. Street fights. Routine. You could be attacked just for looking the wrong way at a noble's horse. And war. Always brewing. Local feuds. Religious crusades. Land disputes. Someone is always marching off to stab someone else for honor, God, or sheer boredom. Violence wasn't a breakdown of society. Life was fragile. Justice was random, and your neighbor might bludgeon you over a pig. So keep your head down, walk carefully, and don't trust anyone holding a club. By now, you've made it through lice, leeches, unwashed clothes, and public But now comes the final chapter of most medieval lives. An early and unimpressive death. If you're still alive past 40, you're a rarity. They might even call you the Old One, which is less a nickname and more a statistical shock. Let's break it down. The average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years, but that's heavily skewed by infant mortality. Nearly half of all children died before age 5. Disease, malnutrition, and bad winters ended lives early. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no real hope. If you survived childhood, you entered adulthood already worn out. Work started once you could stand. By 25, your joints creaked like a monastery door. You're likely missing several teeth, maybe a finger, and most of your optimism. For women, childbirth was the main threat. No prenatal care, no clean tools, no pain relief, just hot water, prayer, and someone holding your hand as you bled on a straw-stuffed cot. For men, the dangers were different but just as harsh. Farm accidents, infections from small wounds, drunken neighbors, a crusade gone wrong. Even walking to the market could be dangerous if you crossed paths with a bored bandit or an angry tax collector. Death could also arrive quietly from the plague, which turned cities into graveyards overnight, or from famine, which lasted entire seasons and thinned out entire villages, or from sheer bad luck like eating spoiled grain and spending your final hours hallucinating and screaming at the walls. And funerals? You were lucky if you got one. Bodies were buried quickly to prevent disease. No embalming. No polished coffins, just a hole in the ground. A few whispered prayers, and a shallow mound of dirt if there was still room left in the churchyard. So yes, in medieval times, life was harsh, short, and always under threat from death in its many casual forms. There was no retirement. You simply stopped showing up. And speaking of endings, let's move on to your final chapter. The medieval dream. So, how's your day been? Worked until your spine begged for mercy, scratched through itchy wool, prayed not to get the plague, and barely avoided public execution for owning a squirrel. You woke up in filth, relieved yourself into a bucket, brushed your teeth with wishful thinking, nearly fainted from hunger. Welcome to a regular day in medieval Europe. Still dreaming of becoming a knight? Think. That romanticized version of the Middle-Ages chivalrous warriors. Noble ladies in towers, heroic battles, and candlelit feasts. Mostly a myth shaped by fairy tales and fantasy novels. In reality, the medieval world was dirty, cruel, and deeply unequal. Hierarchy was everything. If you were born poor, you stayed poor. If you were born rich, congratulations, you had better odds of surviving. But you were still just one bad bowl of soup away from dysentery and a quick burial. Even the nobles weren't safe from misery. Castles were cold stone shelters filled with fleas, smoke, and political marriages. Sure, you had a fur cloak and wine, but also a 50% chance of dying in battle or from an infected splinter. Not exactly luxury. The so-called simpler times weren't simple. They were relentless. Everything took longer. Everything was harder. Everything from childbirth to chewing had risks. Life was survival, not leisure. And if you ever did find a quiet moment to reflect or imagine something better, there wasn't much you could do with it. No social mobility, no modern medicine, no internet to search. What is this weird rash? Most people lived, suffered, worked, and died within 10 miles of where they were born. But here's the surprising part. Even through all of this, people still laughed, sang, told stories, fell in love, and searched for meaning. Not because life was easy, but because humans are resilient like that. Even in the hardest times, they made room for light. So tonight, when you lie down in a clean bed with indoor plumbing, antibiotics, and central heating maybe, take a moment to quietly thank the modern world and your ancestors who endured rats, famine, and feudalism. So you wouldn't have to. Long before she became Catherine, the great tempress of all Russia's reformer and symbol of ambition, she was simply Sophie, born Sophie Friedrich August von Anhaltz, Ebsden 1729. She came from a relatively minor German noble family. Her small duchy in Pomerania offered little influence, but Sophie herself had something no title could provide: sharp intelligence, quiet charm, and a steady determination for greatness. Her upbringing was strict. Her mother, Johanna, was cold and ambitious, not nurturing, but deeply focused on climbing the social ladder. Her father, a Prussian officer, was distant, more preoccupied than involved. From a young age, Sophie learned how to walk the line between obedience and strategy. She read constantly, learned several languages, and practiced observing a room before speaking. These would become survival skills in one of Europe's most dangerous courts. When Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrovna began searching for a wife for her heir, Grand Duke Peter, she looked outside Russia. Peter was of German descent, and Elizabeth believed a foreign bride, grateful and controllable, would be easier to manage. Sophie matched the criteria. Noble blood, a Lutheran background soon to be abandoned, a reputation for grace and modesty. At just 14 years old, Sophie was summoned to Russia. She arrived in the frozen capital of St. Petersburg in 1744, dressed in thin German fabrics and a diplomatic smile. Her mother pushed her forward like a chess piece. But Sophie had a different game in mind. To be accepted in Russian society, she converted to Orthodoxy and took a new name, Yekaterina. The ceremony was public, symbolic, and transformative. She wasn't just changing religion, she was leaving everything behind and stepping into an empire with no way back. No one looking at that quiet teenager in fur-trimmed clothing could have predicted what came next. Betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, and empire. From the moment Sophie entered the Russian court, she stopped being a pawn and began planning how to become a queen. Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was meant to secure her place in Russian royalty. But from the start, it felt more like confinement than power. Peter, heir to the throne, was far from a fairy tale prince. Awkward, immature, and fixated on toy soldiers, he spent more time staging fake battles than ruling or connecting with his wife. Some reports suggest he avoided consummating the marriage for years. He admired Frederick the Great of Prussia and disliked the Russian court that had accepted him. Catherine, by contrast, embraced Russia with intense focus. She learned the language, studied its history, and memorized Orthodox customs. She wanted to belong. Peter wanted to leave. This wasn't just a personal issue, it was political. The Russian court was filled with gossip, suspicion, and ruthless power games. Empress Elizabeth still held authority, but her health was failing. Everyone saw a shift coming, and everyone had a plan. Catherine was under constant watch. Her letters were inspected, her friendships tracked, her actions recorded. She couldn't rely on her husband, her mother still working for foreign interests, or even her staff. In such an environment, alliances could turn into threats overnight. But Catherine was careful. She learned the rules of court politics and quietly gathered support. She built relationships with military leaders, intellectuals, and nobles. She became known for calm and dignitary, sharp contrast to Peter's immaturity, and contempt for Russian traditions. Behind the scenes, she read Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu. While others saw a young consort, Catherine was forming a vision not just for herself, but for Russia. One of education, strength, and reason. But there was one problem. As long as Peter lived, she remained powerless, a wife married to an unfit ruler. So she waited, listened, and prepared. She knew the Russian throne wouldn't be inherited. It would have to be taken. In 1762, after nearly 20 years of patience and planning, Catherine seized her chance. Empress Elizabeth died. Peter became Tsar Peter III. But his rule fell apart almost instantly. In a few months, Peter offended the church, upset the nobility, alienated the army, and praised Prussia, Russia's longtime enemy. He reversed major policies, insulted religious leaders, and discussed divorcing Catherine to marry his mistress. The court, already skeptical of him, turned colder. The army, filled with Catherine's supporters, began to murmur. Even the public saw Peter as a foreign puppet who mocked their customs. Catherine acted. In July, while Peter was away at his summer residence, she led a bloodless coup. With help from loyal military leaders, including her ally and lover, Gregory Orlov, and his brother Shay, rode through St. Petersburg in full regalia. She was declared Empress Catherine II and won the loyalty of the Imperial Guard. Peter, surprised and isolated, surrendered within days. He was taken into Casidia, and soon after, he died under suspicious circumstances. Officially, it was hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, it was likely murder. Catherine was now empress not by birth or marriage, but through strategy and resolve. It was unprecedented. A foreign-born woman with no legal claim had taken the Russian throne without bloodshed. But her biggest challenge was ahead, turning a bold power grab into a lasting reign. Could Russia accept her? Would the nobility support her? Could she hold the empire together? Catherine understood that power won by intrigue could be lost the same way. She had to govern not as a plotter but as a reformer, and so began her shift from cautious operator to enlightened monarch, one who would reshape borders, champion knowledge, and redefine female leadership. Once she had the crown, Catherine could have focused only on power, but she had larger goals. She wanted to transform Russia not just through war or law but through ideas. While Peter idolized Frederick and played with miniatures, Catherine admired Voltaire, Diderot, and Enlightenment ideals. She believed in progress, reason, education, and a ruler's duty to serve the people even while holding absolute authority. Catherine didn't just read Enlightenment ideas, she lived them. She wrote to Voltaire for 15 years, praising his work while defending her rule. She invited Diderot to court and even bought his entire library to support him financially. Privately, she studied legal theory, debated reforms, and worked on plans to modernize the empire. Early in her reign, she created the Legislative Commission in 1767, an ambitious effort to rewrite Russia's entire legal system. Her nakaz was more than guidance kit, was a political statement. It promoted equality before the law, condemned torture, and stressed that rulers serve the common good. Radical for a monarch in 18th century Russia. But Catherine knew ideas had to be balanced with reality. Russia was huge, feudal, and conservative. Its nobles liked their serfs exactly where they were beneath them. So Catherine moved carefully. She ended some forms of torture, promoted secular education, and established new schools and libraries. But she also confirmed the nobility's control over their serfs to maintain their support. This was Catherine's careful balancing act. A philosopher queen in public, a practical ruler in private. She walked a fine line between ideals and necessity, between the refined salons of Paris and the rough politics of Moscow. Her vision for Russia was ambitious, but always calculated. In many ways, Catherine wasn't trying to make Russia more European. She was trying to make it modern in her own way. That meant reform, certainly, but guided by a firm hand wrapped in diplomacy. Catherine wasn't satisfied with changing Russia from within. She aimed to expand it beyond its borders, building an empire that would command respect, fear, and attention. Where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west, Catherine sought to tear down the walls altogether. Under her rule, Russia's territory grew larger than ever. She fought wars, not just to protect her position, but to reshape the political landscape of Europe. One of her major military efforts was against the Ottoman Empire. These conflicts, fought in stages during the 1760s and 1770s, were about more than land. They were about power and presence. Catherine viewed herself as the defender of Orthodox Christians under Muslim rule and as the legitimate guardian of Eastern Europe, with generals like Alexander Suvorov and Gregory Potemkin leading her forces. Russia secured key areas, including Crimea, the northern Black Sea coast, and, crucially, access to warm water ports. Russian Tsars had desired warm water ports for generations. These victories weren't just military, they were symbolic. With every conquest, Catherine sent a clear message. Russia was no longer Europe's distant, undeveloped cousin. It was now a serious continental power. Through a series of negotiations and political deals, she also turned her attention westward. Catherine joined the partitions of Poland, dividing the weakened Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with Austria and Prussia. By the final partition in 1795, Poland had disappeared from the map, and Russia gained vast new territories and millions of new citizens. But Catherine didn't only expand her empire with armies, she did it with ideas. New cities were founded. Trade routes grew. German settlers were encouraged to farm Russian land. Her empire became a diverse patchwork, stretching from the cold Baltic Sea to the sunny Black Sea coast. And through all of this, Catherine remained firmly in charge, reading reports, giving orders, and directly overseeing the direction of her growing empire. Critics called her ambitious, or even but for Catherine, expansion wasn't about personal ambition. It was about purpose. She believed a ruler's greatness was not just shown by ideas, but also by how far their borders reached. Catherine didn't just want to rule Russia. She wanted to remake it into a strong, respected, and loyal empire that reflected her vision alone. Despite her political success, Catherine the Great was equally well known for what happened behind palace walls. And not all of it was whispered in study halls. Her private life became one of the most discussed parts of her reign. She had lovers, more than a few, often younger, attractive, and sometimes politically useful. She didn't hide them. In fact, she often rewarded them with titles, land, or pensions if they remained loyal. If not, they were quietly dismissed, sometimes with a thank you and a promotion. One of the most important among them was Gregory Potemkin, a man as bold as he was intelligent. Their relationship blurred the lines between personal and political. Some historians believe they may have even secretly married. Together, they directed military campaigns, planned colonization efforts, and helped shape southern Russia's development. Potemkin wasn't just a lover. He was, in many ways, a co-ruler. Still, Europe focused on the scandal. Gossip spread quickly. Satirical pamphlets portrayed her as excessive, unstable, or worse. And after her death, the rumors grew even more outrageous. The most infamous, a false and vulgar story involving a horse, was entirely invented by her enemies to damage her reputation. Why the obsession? Simple. Catherine was a woman who held power without apology. In a time when female rulers were expected to be either saintly or tragic, she refused to fit the mold. She lived, loved, and governed on her own terms. And that made her threatening to many. Ironically, while others painted her as immoral, Catherine herself had a thoughtful view of love and sexuality. She believed pleasure was a natural part of life, and that private relationships didn't have to interfere with public duty. She separated emotion from governance, something many male rulers struggled to do. In reality, her relationships were often strategic. She surrounded herself with men who were loyal, competent, and politically valuable, and when they were no longer useful, she let them go on with grace and a generous pension. Catherine's love life didn't weaken her authority, was part of how she managed power, a careful mix of affection and strategy that made her memorable, admired, and feared. Still, for all her strength and charisma, Catherine's reign was not without threats. In 1773, one of the most serious came in the form of a Cossack named Yevgeny Pugachev. He wasn't a typical rebel. Pugachev claimed to be Peter III, Catherine's deceased husband. According to him, he had survived the coup and returned to reclaim his throne from the so-called foreign USURPER. It was a lie. Peter was long dead. But to Russia's poor and overworked classes, the truth didn't matter. They just needed something to believe in. Pugachev promised freedom and end to serfdom, lower taxes, and land for regular people. His message ignited unrest across the Volga River region, especially among Cossacks, peasants, and old believers. At a time when the divide between nobles and serfs had grown harsh, his promises felt like deliverance. The Pugachev Rebellion became the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Towns were seized, fortresses captured, and nobles killed. For a moment, it seemed the empire might split apart. Catherine was shaken. This wasn't a war she could settle with cavalry or diplomacy. It was an internal uprising, her own people turning against the system she governed. But she didn't panic. She responded. Catherine sent professional troops to suppress the rebellion without hesitation. Pugachev's forces were defeated in 1774. He was captured, paraded in an iron cage, and eventually executed in Moscow, a public warning to discourage future revolts. Afterward, Catherine strengthened state control. Her earlier hopes of freeing the serfs quietly disappeared. The uprising had shown the limits of Enlightenment ideals in a country still bound by feudal systems. She began relying more on the nobility, who, in exchange for their loyalty, were allowed complete authority over their serfs. This marked a shift. The empress, who once quoted Voltaire, now prioritized order over philosophy. Reforms became slower. Surveillance increased. Rebellio Evan, a rumor, was to be crushed early. Pugachev lost his life, but his revolt left a lasting message. Power based on inequality was always at risk of collapse. By the time Catherine approached the final years of her life, she had ruled Russia for over 30 years, longer than any female ruler in the nation's history. From the moment she took power, she challenged expectations, reshaped the state, and redefined what a woman monarch could be. Under her rule, Russia became a significant European power. Its borders expanded by over 200,000 square miles, absorbing Crimea, parts of Poland, and stretches of the Black Sea coast. These weren't just military victories. They were strategic advances, securing key ports and trade routes. But Catherine's legacy wasn't just territorial. She also left a strong cultural impact. She helped found the Hermitage Museum, gathered one of Europe's largest art collections, and corresponded with leading Enlightenment thinkers. Her court became a center for art, learning, and intellectual life. In a country long viewed as backward by the West, Catherine placed Russia firmly on the cultural stage. She improved education, opening schools for girls, and promoted printing and publishing. She introduced smallpox vaccination to Russia, even receiving it herself, an unusual public gesture at the time. Yet her rule remained full of contradictions. While she supported Enlightenment values, she never abolished serfdom. In fact, she expanded it into new territories. Her reforms, though notable, were mostly from the top down, designed to refine the empire, not completely reshape its foundations. Still, Catherine's leadership brought both stability and vision. She understood that power was not granted by birth, had to be maintained, built, and protected. Her authority came not from divine claim, but from strategy and constant effort. She was called many things: manipulator, reformer, tyrant, strategist. But above all, she was effective. By the time she died in 1796, Russia was stronger, wealthier, and larger than it had been in centuries. She left a secure throne, an expanded empire, and a legacy that would last well beyond her time. Catherine didn't just hold the crown. She redefined what it meant to earn one. Despite her achievements, she remained, at her core, a woman in a male-dominated world, shaping it to reflect her image. Behind the portraits and decrees was someone very aware of how fragile her position had been. She wasn't Russian by birth. She gained power through a coup. She ruled a nation that didn't want a woman on the throne, yet she endured and thrived. Catherine never settled for symbolic roles. She read constantly, wrote extensively, and kept learning. Her daily routine was demanding reading state reports, managing correspondence, editing laws, and guiding a court full of competing interests. She didn't simply occupy the throne. She worked as though she had always belonged there. She was also often alone, though surrounded by nobles, advisors, and lovers. She wrote about how few people she truly trusted. Her son Paul, whom she kept at a distance from politics, became a man she feared might undo her work. Her deepest partnership with Gregory eventually evolved into close friendship, but his death in 1791 left a lasting, emotional scar. Catherine crafted her image carefully. She understood the power of appearances and used them skillfully. She presented herself as Russia's mother, enlightened monarch, military leader, and cultural patron. But behind those public roles was someone who had faced rejection, betrayal, rumors, and revolt and kept going. When she died in 1796, she left behind a changed empire, but also lingering questions. Could she have done more for the serfs? Did her politics compromise her ideals? Was she more reformer or ruler? History remembers her by a title she never chose, the Great. Not because she was perfect, kind, or fair, but because she took power in a time when women weren't expected to have any, and used it entirely on her own terms. She didn't just wear the crown. She rewrote what it meant to deserve one. The interior was covered in powdered cinnabar, a toxic mercury sulfide used ceremonially by the Maya, and lying within that crimson dust was the skeleton of a woman. She had been buried with care and reverence. Her bones were delicate, but preserved, her skull still wearing a jade mask, and her body surrounded by funerary offerings, necklaces, diadems, ear spools, all crafted from jade and shell. Everything about the burial pointed to royalty. Yet there was no name, no glyphs to identify her. It was one of the richest female tombs ever found in Mesoamerica, and still, it remained a mystery. Why was she buried in red powder? Who was she? A queen, a priestess, perhaps the wife of Pakal the Great? Researchers began calling her the Red Queen, and the name stayed. But even with modern forensics, her identity remains uncertain. What is known is that she lived around the 7th century, during the golden age of Palenque. Unlike most Maya tombs, hers had been hidden, untouched, and intentionally isolated. Her burial wasn't just ceremonial, it was spiritual. She wasn't meant to be remembered with words, but through ritual, color, and mystery. The most striking feature of her tomb wasn't the jade jewelry or the sealed chamber's silence. It was the red dust. A thick coating of powdered cinnabar covered everything: the sarcophagus, the walls, her bones, and the surrounding offerings. It clung to the stone like dried blood. To the Maya, this was deliberate. Cinnabar, made from crushed mercury sulfide, was among the most sacred and dangerous substances in their world. Its vivid red color was more than decorative. It symbolized blood, renewal, and the life force connecting humans and the divine. Red was sacred, the color of sunrise, sacrifice, and life emerging from death. And it wasn't just symbolic, it held spiritual meaning. Covering the dead in cinnabar was a ritual of transformation, intended not to preserve the body forever, but to guide it through transition. In Maya belief, death wasn't an end, but a crossing into another realm. So the Red Queen, whoever she was prepared not simply for burial, but for ascension. But there's another aspect to this. Cinnabar is toxic. Repeated exposure can cause mercury poisoning, tremors, hallucinations, and even death. The Maya likely didn't know the chemistry, but they sensed its power. It was unstable, intense, dangerous. To coat a body in it was to declare that this person was extraordinary. At Palenque, only a few individuals received such treatment. Pakal the Great, whose pyramid dominates the site, was one of them. His body, like hers, was also saturated in cinnabar. That detail sparked speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife, his mother, or someone of similar divine rank? Her skull had been laid on jaguar skinning, another sacred symbol. Nearby were bone needles, obsidian blades, and tiny jade figures, clues of rituals. done in her lifetime or performed at her burial. Each part of the tomb told a story without words, a story of hidden power and spiritual preparation. A woman set to pass into the underworld, not quietly, but in ritual. Drenched in the color of sacrifice, surrounding the Red Queen's red-stained remains was a chamber of silence, broken only by the shine of jade, shell, and obsidian. These were not simple decorations. They were offerings, carefully chosen to accompany her on the journey into the Maya afterlife. Xibalba. At her sides lay jade necklaces, still heavy and luminous after centuries underground. To the Maya, jade was more than beautiful. It was a symbol of eternal life, the green of maize, the vitality of nature, and the breath of gods. Only the elite were buried with it. For the Red Queen, jade adorned her chest, wrists, and ears, clear signs of status and possibly divine favor. Among the most moving objects was the jade funerary mask placed over her face. Unlike Egypt's golden masks, this one was subtle, made from dozens of tiny mosaic tiles that followed the natural shape of her skull. It served a ritual purpose: to protect the soul, preserve identity, and present her as divine to the gods. Scattered near her remains were bone needles, obsidian blades, and shell artifacts. These might have been ritual tools or symbols of her role: priestess, healer, or royal matriarch. One bone pin bore faint engravings, worn but intentionally an echo of her voice. Long faded dot at her feet, and along the tomb's edges were sealed ceramic vessels, likely once filled with offerings, food, drink, or incense for the journey after death. The Maya viewed the afterlife as a path, difficult, layered, and full of trials. These were not luxuries, they were essentials. To modern observers, the tomb feels deliberate, not crowded, but carefully arranged. There was no gold, no grandeur, no display of power, just objects of spiritual purpose. It was a map for the soul. Through these offerings, we glimpse how the Maya understood death not as an end, but as a change in status. The Red Queen was not buried to be forgotten. She was being prepared to ascend. Yet, for all the richness of her tomb, the Red Queen left behind one profound absence: no name, no inscriptions, no glyphs on the walls or lid. She was clearly important, but who? From the moment the tomb was opened, researchers searched for answers. The most compelling theory suggests the Red Queen was Zak Cook, the wife of Kyanich, Janab Pakel, known today as Pakel the Great, the most famous ruler of Palenque. Zak Cook was more than just ... Pakl single quotes as consort. She was born into nobility and married into Palenque's royal family at a young age. She gave birth to at least 3 sons, all of whom held high status, and she played a key ceremonial role during her husband's reign. If anyone deserved such an honored burial, it was her. Supporting this theory is the tomb's location, just a few feet from Pakel's own grand burial in the Temple of the Inscriptions. This closeness suggests a deliberate connection: husband and wife, rulers in life and death. And then there's the cinnabar. Only 2 burials in Palenque have been found with such heavy cinnabar use: Pakali's and the Red Queen's. That's unlikely to be coincidence. But the mystery deepens. DNA tests were run on both sets of remains to confirm a connection. The results, however, were inconclusive. The woman's bones showed no direct maternal link to Pakala, but that doesn't rule out a spousal relationship. Marriage doesn't require shared blood. Some believe she may have been Zak Cook, Pakel's powerful mother, who ruled Palenque before he came of age. Others suggest she could have been a high priestess, a sister, or a royal ancestor whose name has simply been lost over time. Still, the strongest evidence points to Sukbu Ajah, queen by title, mother of kings, and a spiritual partner to Pakel. The missing name may not be an oversight, it could have been intentional. In Maya belief, the soul lived on not through carved words, but through ritual, symbols, and the earth's quiet memory. So the Red Queen remained suspended between history and legend. A woman remembered not through inscriptions, but through scarlet dust and silence. To understand the Red Queen, we must understand the world she came from, a world where Maya, women, especially those of royal blood, held more power than many realize. In Maya society, politics was often a family matter. Royal women weren't just wives, they were diplomats, priestesses, and political players. They led rituals, funded temples, and helped maintain dynastic authority. Their family lines were political assets used to form alliances and support claims to the throne. Take Kuk, the mother of Pakal the Great. When the throne was left empty, she ruled as queen regent until her son was old enough to take power. She wasn't just filling, and she ruled in her own right, issuing orders and overseeing major building projects. Without her, Pakal might never have risen at all, and she wasn't alone. Across the Maya world in cities like Yaxchila and Calakmul, inscriptions show women leading rituals, engaging in diplomacy and warfare, and sometimes ruling outright. They appear in stone carvings and murals, wearing elaborate headdresses, standing beside kings as equals or above them. Their names were once carved in glyphs, remembered through generations, until they weren't. By the time Spanish conquerors arrived, much of that memory had faded. The colonial view reduced native women to passive figures in a male-centered world. But archaeology tells another story, one of complex gender roles, where power was shared and negotiated. This context changes how we see the Red Queen. She may not have ruled by title, but her sacred burial next to Pakal suggests she was a key figure in the royal household. Her jade mask was not just decoration, it represented identity and authority, both in life and in death. Her lineage may have been the very thread that held Palanca's dynasty together. In Maya civilization, a queen wasn't only a consort. She was the keeper of sacred bloodlines, a ceremonial voice, and often a bridge between gods and people. The Red Queen may remain nameless, but in her time, she was never without a voice. The Red Queen wasn't just buried with riches, she was buried in architecture filled with meaning, shaped by Maya beliefs, ritual practices, and deliberate design. Her tomb wasn't simply a grave, it was a gateway to the beyond. Her remains were found inside Temple 13, one of the smaller pyramids near the center of Palenque. Its closeness to the Temple of the Inscriptions, where Pakal lies, is significant. These temples weren't placed randomly. Their positions followed sacred patterns based on astronomy, myth, and royal tradition. Temple 13 looks modest next to its larger neighbor, but it hides something far more personal. A sealed crypt, undisturbed and perfectly preserved. It was built deep inside the temple's core, reachable only by a steep, narrow staircase. The descent into the chamber feels symbolic, a journey downward into the underworld. The tomb itself is simple, cut stone, tightly sealed for over 1,300 years. No murals or glyphs decorate the walls. No carvings tell her story. But perhaps that silence was intentional. This was not a space for the living to read, it was for the dead to transform. At the center rests her sarcophagus, shaped from limestone. It echoes Pakal's stone coffin in the temple next door. While Pakal's lid is famously engraved with cosmic imagery, the Red Queen's tomb is more restrained. The focus is inward on the body, the cinnabar, and the ritual of death. Still, subtle features offer meaning. The tomb's east-west alignment mirrors the sun's path, from birth to death. The space is small, but powerful, clearly built, with purpose. A sacred enclosure for someone deeply respected. Maya temples were not just buildings, they were symbolic structures, connecting the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. To be buried inside one was to be elevated beyond human life. The Red Queen's final resting place wasn't improvised. It was a carefully planned shrine where death became transformation. Her bones rest in stone, her presence in cinnabar, her legacy in the architecture itself. A temple that speaks not with words, but with intention, reminding us she mattered. To the ancient Maya, death wasn't the end. It was a crossing, a sacred step into the underworld, known as Shabalba. And for the Red Queen, this journey was not just spiritual. It was political, cosmological, and carefully ritualized. Maya burial customs were detailed events, deeply rooted in myth, meant to guide the soul through the many layers of the underworld. Texts and imagery from the period show us that Xibalba was no peaceful paradise. It was a dark realm of blood rivers, tests, and gods of death. Only those who were properly buried, ritually prepared, and spiritually equipped could make the journey through. The Red Queen was buried, wrapped in cinnabar, encased in stone, and surrounded by offerings, all signs of an elite burial. But there's more. The presence of bone needles and obsidian blades in her tomb suggests auto-sacrifice rituals, possibly tools representing rites she had performed in life, or reenacted during her burial to empower her spirit. Her funerary mask, carefully made from jade tiles, wasn't just decorative. It likely served as a spiritual vessel, preserving her face and identity for her journey into the afterlife. In Maya belief, the face reflected the soul, and the soul needed to be recognized by the gods. The ceramic vessels around her may have once held chocolate, maize, water, or even pulque to nourish her in the next world. Other objects, like stingray, spines, or shell trumpets, may have served as spiritual tools, calls to the gods, or symbols of ritual. Communication. Burial wasn't just a farewell, was a transformation. The Maya believed in cycles, death as seed, burial as planting, and the afterlife as rebirth. Kings and queens were often seen as living representatives of gods, and in death, they returned to their divine origins. The Red Queen, covered in the color of blood, entombed in a pyramid, and honored with offerings, was being prepared not just for rest, but for rebirth. Not as a mortal, but as someone tied to the sacred cosmic order. Her burial wasn't the end of her story. It was the start of her legend. Just steps from the Red Queen's final resting place lies one of Mesoamerica's most iconic tombs of Kinich Jenab Pakal, known as Pakal the Great. His burial, inside the Temple of the Inscriptions, is renowned for its artistry, scale, and spiritual meaning. But what makes the Red Queen's tomb remarkable is not only what it contained, but where it was found. Her sarcophagus lay hidden within Temple 3, directly beside Pakal's monument, in Palenquia City, where every temple was placed with purpose. This proximity wasn't chance, it was deliberate. Many scholars believe the Red Queen was Tizakbu Ajah, Pakal's queen and trusted consort. Her tomb holds no inscriptions, but the similarities between their burials are striking. Both were covered in cinnabar. Both were buried in pyramids. Both were surrounded by jade and treated with deep respect. These rituals mirror one another, two halves of a sacred story. Pakal's tomb famously shows him descending the underworld tria, cosmic image of death and rebirth. The Red Queen's simpler chamber contains no carvings, but her presence beside him carries its own meaning. If Pakal represented the sun moving through the underworld to rise again, the Red Queen may have symbolized the moon of feminine force following its own sacred path. Together, they reflected cosmic balance, male and female, king and queen, sun and moon, rule and ritual. In Maya belief, leadership was not singular, it was relational. Cosmic harmony required duality, and that balance extended into the royal court. By placing the Red Queen beside Pakal, the Maya were preserving not just a marriage but a sacred partnership. Their closeness in death may have echoed their roles in life, a queen, not behind her king, but beside him, sharing not only a throne, but a legacy. In their tombs, they speak without words. Two lives wrapped in cinnabar and stone, joined for eternity. A silence more powerful than speech. Though her name is lost to time, the Red Queen of Palenque, enduring figure, not forgotten, but deeply mysterious. Her tomb, sealed for over 1,300 years, still stirs curiosity. She is a mystery that continues to resist final answers. We may never know her exact identity. No carved name, no inscribed stele, tells her story. Yet the care in her burial, the richness of her offerings, and the symbolism in her crimson bones point to a woman of real importance, not just a wife, but a figure of power, ceremony, and royal lineage. The Red Queen challenges our assumptions. She reminds us that in Maya civilization, women were not silent. They led rituals, influenced politics, and helped shape dynasties. While kings like Pakel are well known, her reemergence urges us to look deeper. Power wasn't just in the hands of men, it flowed through queens, mothers, priestesses, and visionaries. Her legacy is more than the treasures left behind. It's the conversation she continues to inspire among archaeologists, historians, and storytellers. Every jade bead, every trace of cinnabar, every element of her temple suggests one thing clearly. This woman mattered, and perhaps that's the most powerful part of her story. Not what we know, but what we don't. The Red Queen shows us that history isn't just a record of facts. It's a puzzle we all share, a way to connect with those who came before us. In that way, her story is still unfolding. She rests wrapped in red, the color of blood and renewal. Her face, once hidden by jade, now meets us through science, art, and wonder. She remains nameless, but not silent, mysterious, but not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled in life, but in death, she reigns in our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone, her story written in silence, and still, somehow, speaks. Her right leg was shattered, her foot dislocated, her collarbone and ribs broken, her shoulder was dislocated, her abdomen was pierced. She was just 18. Someone covered her with a borrowed coat. Another person noticed her body appeared to shimmer not from blood, but from the gold powder she had been carrying in a pouch. It had burst on impact, dusting her broken body in what looked like glittering ash. Frida was taken to the Red Cross hospital, where she underwent multiple surgeries over the next few months. She spent weeks in a body cast flat on her back, unable to move, battling infection and uncertainty. The future she had imagined, becoming a doctor, slipped further away each day. But in that stillness, something began to change. Her father gave her paintbrushes. Her mother rigged a special easel that hung over her bed. A mirror was fixed above her so she could see herself. And there, lying in plaster and pain, Frida began to paint. At first, it was just a pastime, but soon, it became an obsession. Her first subject was herself, because that was all she had. But what emerged wasn't vanity. It was survival. The crash had broken her body, but it had also opened a door into her mind, her physical self, and eventually into the surreal visual, the language of pain and identity that would define her work. The girl who once wanted to heal others now began to heal herself, one brushstroke at a time, lying in a body cast, fighting pain with every breath. Frida began painting. What started as therapy turned into a way of communicating. Her work was deeply personal, brutally honest, and often uncomfortable to witness, which was part of the purpose. Frida didn't paint flowers or gentle landscapes. She painted pain, pain physical, emotional, and existential. Her first paintings were self-portraits, not out of vanity, but as she put it, "I paint myself because I am so often alone and because I am the subject I know best." Her early works were small, painted on tin or wood, inspired by Mexican retablos, devotional paintings that told stories of suffering and healing. Frida turned that tradition inward. Her body became the canvas, her emotions the altar. She painted herself pierced, split, bleeding. In one image, she's impaled by nails like a modern martyr. In another, she floats beside a cracked column, symbolizing her broken spine. She painted herself weeping, fragmented, decapitated, but never passive, always watching. Her pain was not softened. She painted the rawness of trauma with beauty, defiance, and even humor. Each painting reclaimed her body, her story, and her place as a woman in a world that often tried to define her. But Frida wasn't just telling her own story. She was creating a new kind of visual narrative, one that mixed folk art, surrealism, anatomy, and symbolism. Her art became a dreamlike dissection of the self shaped by culture, color, and myth. By the time she could walk again slowly and painfully, Frida was no longer the girl who dreamed of medicine. She was an artist, and her art was unlike anything anyone had seen. She had turned the worst thing that happened to her into the start of something new. Frida didn't just express pain. She made others see it, and in doing so, she made suffering a form of creation. 1928, still recovering, still painting, and just 21 years old, Frida met the man who would become the most important and difficult figure in her life, Diego Rivera. He was 20 years older, already the most famous painter in Mexico. A towering figure, both literally and artistically. Rivera was known for his bold, political murals celebrating Mexican life and history. Frida had seen his work and admired it, but now she wanted his opinion of hers. She brought her paintings to the Ministry of Education, where he was working, and interrupted him on his scaffold. She asked, simply, "Do I have talent?" Diego looked at her work and replied, "Yes, and not just to be kind." He saw something rare in unfiltered voice, raw and honest, full of irony, pain, and beauty. They began a relationship that was intense and creative. Frida once said, "I suffered 2 accidents in my life, one in which a streetcar ran me over. The other was Diego." They married in 1929. To many, it seemed like an unlikely match. Diego was large, famous, unfaithful. Frida was sharp, independent, and already walking with a cane. Her parents described it as a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their relationship was passionate but unstable. Diego supported Frida's painting and pushed her to grow. But he was also repeatedly unfaithful, even with Frida's sister, Cristina. Frida was devastated. In response, she took lovers of her own men and women including rumored affairs with Leon Trotsky and artist Georgia O. Single quotes Keefe. They divorced in 1939, then remarried the following year with new terms. This time, Frida kept her own house, name, and finances. Their second marriage was less about romance and more about artistic partnership and mutual understanding. Despite the heartbreak, Diego remained central in Frida's life. He challenged her, hurt her, but also believed in her as a painter, a revolutionary, and a woman who could redefine art. They weren't peaceful, but they were unforgettable. In the 1930s, Frida followed Diego to the United States, San Francisco, Detroit, New York, where he worked on large public murals. These years abroad exposed her to American industrialism, wealth, and the contradictions of capitalism, and it left her uneasy. Frida was deeply nationalist, a committed communist, and proud of indigenous traditions. The luxury she saw in the U.S., especially during the Great Depression, only deepened her disillusionment. In letters home, she mocked American materialism and its focus on appearances. She missed Mexico's color, complexity, and contradictions. While Diego painted grand murals in factories, Frida painted smaller, more personal pieces, quiet revolutions on canvas and tin. Her style became distinct, surreal, sharp, emotional, and intimate. She created some of her most recognized works during this period, nearly all self-portraits. But they weren't about appearance. They were about endurance. With her body still in pain from the accident, surgeries, and a miscarriage in Detroit, she turned inward. Her paintings showed her bleeding, fractured, and exposed, but always calm, always direct, always herself. One of her most powerful pieces, Henry Ford Hospital, shows her lying on a bed, crying, surrounded by floating images, a fetus, a snail, surgical tools, a broken pelvis. It was personal, graphic, and deeply emotional, a painting that did not hide anything. Back in Mexico, Frida became more involved in politics. She and Diego even housed Leon Trotsky while he was in exile. She wore Tehuana dresses, traditional indigenous clothing, not just as style, but as political expression. For Frida, art, identity, and belief were inseparable. While Diego painted revolutions on walls, Frida painted what they caused: the body in fragments, the mind alight, and the self always staring back. In illness and isolation, Frida Kahlo became more than a painter a painter of resistance. When she returned to Mexico in the late 1930s, she was no longer just Diego Rivera's wife. She had become something else entirely, powerful artist whose work expressed raw truth, surreal imagery, and deep cultural identity. Back home, she embraced herself fully. Her Casa Azul in Cayocan became a space of color and contrast. Bright cobalt walls, yellow trim, Aztec statues in the garden, monkeys and parrots roaming freely. The house reflected Frida's mind, a mix of tradition and rebellion, of beauty and earth. She filled it with pre-Columbian relics, ex-votos, folk art, and political books. She wore bold Taiwana dresses, wove flowers into her hair, and painted to the scent of incense and the sounds of street musicians outside. This was a time of great creativity. Her paintings became more detailed, symbolic, and political. Works like the two Fridas showed a divided self, one in European clothing with an open heart, the other in indigenous dress, steady and whole. It was her visual autobiography, a portrait of love, loss, and identity. In 1939, her work was shown in Paris. Artists like Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky praised her unique style. But even among surrealists, Frida stood apart. When André Breton tried to classify her as one of them, she disagreed. "They thought I was a surrealist," she said, "but I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality." She painted Mexico not as a fantasy, but as a living country she loved. Her art was filled with meaning: skeletons, birds, hearts, thorns, corn, and blood. She honored the indigenous roots of her culture while confronting the violence in its history and present. And even as her voice as an artist grew stronger, health declined. Surgeries, infections, and pain became part of everyday life. Yet she kept painting propped up in bed, body in corsets, hands clutching the brush. She had not returned to rest, but to reclaim herself through art, through politics, through fearless self-expression. In the 1940s, Frida's health continued to fail. Her spine weakened. Her right leg stayed infected. Over her lifetime, she had more than 30 surgeries, often one after another. At times, she was confined to bed, wrapped in casts, or held in traction devices. But she kept painting. Each work became a form of release and quiet resistance. Her paintings grew darker and more direct. She stopped hiding pain behind symbols, dot in the broken column. She painted herself split open, nails piercing her body, her spine replaced by a cracked pillar. Yet her face is calm, her eyes firm. Pain had become her constant companion, her enemy, her muse. Her politics grew stronger too. She rejoined the Mexican Communist Party, marched in protests, wrote bold letters, and spoke out against injustice. Even when she couldn't walk, she showed up in a wheelchair, holding signs, chanting slogans. In 1953, Frida had her first solo show in Mexico, a long overdue honor. Her doctors said she couldn't go, so she did what only Frida would do. She arrived in an ambulance, carried in on a stretcher, and placed in the gallery on her bed, dressed in traditional clothing, surrounded by her paintings. She greeted visitors with tequila, laughter, and the same fire in her eyes. Her last works were simple but powerful. In Marxism will give health to the sick. She showed herself in a steel brace, held by Marx's hands, pushing away images of oppression. Her final known painting was a still life of cut watermelons, one piece bearing the words, "Viva la vida," long live life. Even near death, she remained joyful, political, and defiant. Frida Kahlo's final paintings were more than they were acts of protest, painted in pain but signed with life. On July 13, 1954, at age 47, Frida Kahlo died in the same home where she was born, Casa Azul in Coyoacán. The cause was listed as a pulmonary embolism, but those close to her believed it went deeper. She was ill, yes, but also worn down by pain, surgeries, and a lifetime of struggle. Just days earlier, she had joined a protest against the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala week. In a wheelchair, her fist still raised. Her final diary entry read, "I hope the exit is joyful land. I hope never to return." Her funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's top cultural space. Her body was draped in the red flag of the Communist Party, watched over by family, friends, artists, and political allies. Diego Rivera was heartbroken. He called her the greatest love of his life, despite all the ways he had hurt her. Yet something remarkable happened after her death. Frida Kahlo did not fade away. At first, her name was known only in art circles. Her work didn't fit easy categories too. political for surrealism, to surreal for classic styles. But over time, her image and her truth began to connect dots. In the 1970s and 1980s, feminist scholars and activists began to rediscover her. Frida's voice grew louder. She was no longer just an artist. She was a symbol of pain turned to beauty, of feminism born from struggle, of Mexican identity honored without apology, of queerness, disability, and defiant truth. Her face with its unibrow, steady gaze, and crown of flowers became iconic. Her house became a museum. Her journal became a cherished record. Her paintings entered major museums across the world. Frida had lived much of her life in Diego's shadow, but in death, she stepped forward. She didn't just leave behind paintings, she left behind a mirror. She dared us to look not with pity or fear, but with fire. Today, Frida Kahlo's image is everywhere, on t-shirts, murals, posters, dolls, and digital icons. But her legacy is not just in being recognizable. It's in the truth her image holds. She didn't chase perfection. She didn't follow convention. She celebrated what made her different, her disability, her queerness, her politics, her culture, and turned it into art that crossed borders and generations. She is more than an artist. She is a global symbol of strength, pride, resistance, and creativity. For queer people, she is a proud bisexual icon who lived openly in a time that demanded silence. For women, she is a reminder that power needs no permission. For disabled artists, she proves pain doesn't end creativity, feeds it. And from Mexico, she is a reclaimed daughter, fierce, folkloric, and forever part of its soul. Her paintings, once seen as strange or too personal, are now among the most respected in the world. Works like the two Fridas, Self-Portrait with Thorn, Necklace and Hummingbird, and The Broken Column aren't just viewed, they are felt by anyone who has turned suffering into meaning. She lived in the margins and made them the main stage. She embraced contradiction, a communist who wore gold, a woman betrayed who still loved, a broken body with an unbroken spirit, and through it all, she painted not just with color, but with truth. Frida Kahlo never asked to be a symbol. She simply told her story, and in doing so, she told the story of many who had never seen themselves in art before. Today, when we see her face, we see courage, we see color, we see resistance, we see freed not lost, but timeless.